The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty trail as Zeke Morrison guided his weathered horse toward what should have been his sanctuary. After 3 grueling months prospecting for gold in the unforgiving mountains, all he wanted was to reach his modest cabin nestled in the shadow of Devil's Ridge. The year was 1887, and the frontier was still wild enough to swallow a man whole without asking questions. Zeke had built that cabin with his own calloused hands 5 years prior, every log carefully chosen, every nail driven with purpose. It represented everything he had worked for since leaving his family's farm in Missouri: independence, solitude, and the promise of striking it rich in the mineral-rich hills of the Arizona Territory. But as his cabin came into view through the heat shimmer, something was terribly wrong. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney he had left cold, and expensive-looking horses were tethered to the hitching post he had carved himself. The windows that should have been shuttered tight were thrown wide open, and delicate white curtains that definitely didn't belong to him, fluttered in the dry breeze. Zeke's weathered face hardened as he dismounted, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver at his hip. 27 years of frontier life had taught him that unexpected visitors in these parts usually meant trouble of the worst kind. The front door of his cabin swung open before he could even approach, and out stepped 3 of the most elegant ladies he had ever laid eyes on. The first was a striking redhead with porcelain skin and emerald eyes that seemed to catalog his every movement. She wore a burgundy traveling dress that probably cost more than most folks in these parts made in a year. Behind her stood a blonde whose golden hair was pinned up in an elaborate style that spoke of city sophistication and old money. Her ice-blue eyes held a coldness that made the desert heat seem insignificant. The third woman was a brunette with olive skin and dark, mysterious eyes that seemed to hold secrets deeper than the copper mines that dotted the territory. All 3 carried themselves with the kind of refined grace that belonged in Charleston ballrooms, not in the middle of nowhere Arizona. The redhead stepped forward with a smile that didn't quite reach those calculating green eyes. Well, she said, her voice carrying a distinctly southern accent that dripped with honeyed condescension. You must be the gentleman who owns this charming little establishment. Her companions flanked her like well-dressed sentries, their expressions a mixture of amusement and something far more dangerous. I'm Vivian Ashworth, she continued, adjusting her kid gloves with deliberate precision. And these are my dear friends, Miss Charlotte Pemberton and Miss Isabella Ramirez. We've taken the liberty of making ourselves at home in your absence. Zeke's jaw tightened as he surveyed his transformed property. Through the open doorway, he could see his simple furnishings had been rearranged, expensive-looking trunks stacked against the walls, and his rough-hewn table now set with fine china that caught the afternoon light like captured starlight. Ladies, he said, his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. I appreciate your initiative, but this is private property. My property. I'll need you to gather your belongings and move along. The words came out more politely than he felt, but his mama had raised him to be respectful to women, even when they were trespassing on his land. Charlotte, the blonde, laughed, a sound like breaking crystal that somehow managed to be both beautiful and menacing. Oh, how delightfully rustic, she drawled, her own accent carrying hints of refined Virginia society. But I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding, mister. She paused expectantly, one perfectly sculpted eyebrow raised in question. When Zeke remained silent, she continued with that same brittle smile. We have a perfectly legal document that says otherwise. Isabella, would you be so kind as to show our host the paperwork? The dark-haired woman produced a folded document from her reticule with the flourish of a magician revealing a particularly impressive trick. The paper bore official-looking seals and stamps that seemed legitimate enough, though Zeke couldn't make heads or tails of the elaborate legal language scrawled across the page in flowing script. As you can see, Isabella said, her voice carrying a slight Spanish accent that spoke of aristocratic breeding, this property has been deeded to us by the Territorial Land Office in Tucson. Apparently, there was some issue with your original claim, unpaid taxes, failure to file proper documentation, something tediously bureaucratic. Zeke snatched the document, his eyes scanning the incomprehensible legal jargon. The seals looked official enough, and the signatures appeared genuine, but something about the whole situation felt wrong in ways he couldn't quite articulate. "This is impossible," he growled, his patience wearing thin as desert topsoil. "I've paid every tax, filed every paper, done everything by the book. There's got to be some mistake." But even as he said the words, doubt crept into his voice like water seeping through rock. The frontier was notorious for its corrupt officials and questionable land deals, and plenty of honest men had lost everything to smooth-talking swindlers with official-looking paperwork. Vivian's smile widened, revealing teeth as perfect and predatory as a mountain cat's. "Oh, I'm sure it's all perfectly legitimate," she purred, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her expensive dress. "These territorial offices are frightfully disorganized, aren't they? But not to worry, we're not entirely unreasonable women. We've discussed the situation among ourselves, and we've come up with what we believe is a perfectly equitable arrangement." Her green eyes glittered with something that made Zeke's skin crawl, despite the overwhelming heat. Charlotte stepped closer, close enough that he could smell her expensive French perfume mixing with the desert sage. "You see, we find ourselves in need of someone with your particular skill set," she said, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "Someone who knows this country, who can handle the more practical aspects of frontier living. We're willing to allow you to remain on the property, but in a somewhat different capacity than you might be accustomed to." The way she said it made it clear that whatever they had in mind, it wasn't going to be an arrangement between equals. Isabella circled around behind him like a beautiful predator, her dark eyes never leaving his face. "What my friends are trying to say is that we need a man to handle the rougher aspects of our new life here. Chopping wood, hauling water, maintaining the horses, general labor, that sort of thing. Think of it as steady employment with room and board provided." Her tone was conversational, almost friendly, but there was steel underneath that silk voice that suggested refusal wasn't really an option they were prepared to consider. Zeke felt his temper flare like a struck match. "Are you ladies suggesting I become some kind of hired hand on my own property?" The absurdity of the situation was almost overwhelming. 3 months ago, he had left this place as its owner and master. Now these strange women were standing on his front porch, waving legal papers and offering him the privilege of working as their servant in his own home. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I'm not interested in participating." Vivian's expression hardened slightly, though her smile never wavered. "Oh, but I think you misunderstand the situation, Mr. Morrison." The fact that she knew his name when he hadn't given it sent a chill down his spine despite the oppressive heat. "This isn't really a negotiation. You see, we've already taken possession of the property, and the law is quite clearly on our side. Your choices are really quite simple. Accept our generous offer of employment, or we'll have Sheriff Bradley escort you off the premises immediately. I believe he's expecting our message within the hour." The mention of Sheriff Bradley made Zeke's blood run cold. Tom Bradley was known throughout the territory as a man who could be bought for the right price, and his interpretation of the law tended to favor whoever was paying his salary that particular week. If these women had already gotten to him, Zeke's legal options were limited at best. The nearest territorial judge was 3 days' hard ride away in Phoenix, and by the time he could mount any kind of legal challenge, these mysterious ladies could have solidified their claim beyond any hope of dispute. Charlotte seemed to sense his internal struggle and pressed her advantage with the ruthless efficiency of a seasoned poker player. "We're offering you a very reasonable wage, $5 a week plus meals and a place to sleep. That's more than most ranch hands make in these parts, and considerably more secure than whatever uncertain prospects await you in the gold fields." She gestured toward his travel-worn appearance with one delicate, gloved hand. "Judging by your recent return, I'd say your prospecting endeavors haven't been particularly lucrative." Isabella moved closer still, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her body in the already stifling air. "Of course, we understand that this arrangement might take some adjustment. We're prepared to be patient while you adapt to your new circumstances. After all, we'll be living in close quarters, and harmony is essential for everyone's comfort and safety." The way she emphasized the word safety made it clear that his well-being depended entirely on his cooperation with their proposal. Zeke looked around at his transformed property, feeling like a stranger in his own life. The cabin he had built with his own hands now belonged to these enigmatic women, his rough furnishings replaced or supplemented with their expensive possessions. His solitary retreat transformed into something he barely recognized. The legal document in his hand might as well have been written in ancient Greek for all the good it would do him, and the three ladies watching him with those calculating eyes clearly held all the cards in this particular game. "And if I refuse?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The desert was full of men who had crossed the wrong people and simply disappeared without a trace. The frontier was unforgiving enough without making enemies of people who clearly had connections to money and power. His hand moved unconsciously to his revolver, but he was one man against three women who obviously had resources and allies he could only guess at. Vivian's smile turned positively glacial. "Oh, I don't think you'll refuse," she said with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting her way. "You strike me as an intelligent man, and intelligent men recognize opportunity when it presents itself. Besides, there are worse fates than honest employment with generous employers. The territory is full of men who've lost everything to bad luck, poor judgment, or unfortunate circumstances. At least this way, you'll have a roof over your head and regular meals." The sun was beginning to sink toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Zeke of fresh blood. The symbolism wasn't lost on him as he stood there on his own front porch, essentially being offered the choice between voluntary servitude and forcible exile from everything he had worked to build. The rational part of his mind recognized that accepting their offer was probably the smartest move available to him under the circumstances, but every fiber of his being rebelled against the idea of bowing to their demands. Charlotte seemed to read his thoughts with unsettling accuracy. "We're not unreasonable employers," she said, her voice taking on a slightly softer tone that somehow managed to be even more threatening than her earlier coldness. "Follow our instructions, perform your duties satisfactorily, and you'll find us quite fair in our dealings. We simply require absolute obedience and complete discretion regarding our affairs. What happens on this property stays on this property. That's non-negotiable." Isabella nodded in agreement, her dark eyes never leaving his face. "We value loyalty above all other qualities in our employees," she added, her accent making the words sound almost musical despite their ominous undertones. "Men who serve us faithfully are rewarded generously. Those who disappoint us, well, let's just say that disappointment is something we prefer to avoid whenever possible." The threat in her voice was as subtle as a rattlesnake's warning and just as deadly. Zeke found himself trapped between impossible choices, like a man standing at the edge of a cliff with wolves at his back. Accept their terms and become a servant in his own home, or refuse and face the uncertain dangers of starting over with nothing in a territory controlled by corrupt officials and ruthless opportunists. The three women watched him with the patient intensity of hunters who knew their prey was cornered and had nowhere to run. As the desert wind picked up, stirring the dust around his boots and rattling the unfamiliar curtains in his cabin windows, Zeke Morrison realized that his old life had ended the moment he rode up that dusty trail. Whatever these women really were and whatever they really wanted, he was about to find out in ways he probably wouldn't enjoy. The frontier had always been a place where the strong preyed on the weak, but he had never imagined that strength could come disguised in silk dresses and refined accents, wielding legal documents instead of six-shooters but proving just as dangerous in the end. The choice was no choice at all, and they all knew it. "I accept your terms," Zeke said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The words tasted like ash in his mouth, but survival demanded compromise. "But I want to understand exactly what you expect from me." Vivian clapped her hands together with delight that seemed almost childlike, though her eyes remained cold and calculating. "Wonderful! I knew you were a reasonable man. Your duties will be quite straightforward. Maintain the property, tend the horses, chop firewood, and assist us with any tasks we deem necessary. You'll sleep in the small shed behind the cabin and take your meals with us when we require your presence." Over the following weeks, Zeke settled into his strange new existence with growing unease. The three women maintained their elegant facade during the day, treating him with polite condescension as he performed his duties around the property. But at night, He began to notice peculiar activities that didn't align with their claims of being simple ladies seeking frontier adventure. Strange men arrived under cover of darkness, conducting hushed conversations with the women before disappearing back into the desert. Heavy crates were delivered and stored in the cabin's cellar, a cellar Zeke didn't remember digging. When he asked about these nocturnal visitors, Isabella simply smiled and reminded him that discretion was part of their arrangement. The breaking point came 3 weeks after his reluctant acceptance of their terms. Zeke was repairing a fence post when he overheard a heated argument between Charlotte and a rough-looking stranger who had arrived that morning. The man was demanding payment for services rendered, and Charlotte was insisting that their agreement didn't include the level of violence he had employed. "The banker wasn't supposed to die," she hissed, her refined accent slipping slightly under stress. "Dead men can't sign transfer papers, you fool. Now we'll have to wait for his estate to clear probate before we can access his holdings." Zeke's blood ran cold as the implications hit him. These weren't just wealthy ladies playing at frontier life. They were criminals, using his property as a base for operations that included theft, fraud, and apparently murder. The legal document claiming his land was undoubtedly forged, part of an elaborate scheme to establish themselves in the territory with a legitimate front. That night, as the women entertained another group of suspicious visitors, Zeke made his decision. He crept to the cabin's cellar and discovered crates filled with stolen goods, silver from ransacked mines, jewelry that probably came from robbed stagecoaches, and stacks of forged documents bearing official-looking seals. Among the papers, he found the truth about his own situation, a detailed plan to frame him for their crimes before eliminating him as a witness. The sound of footsteps on the wooden floor above made him freeze. Vivian's voice drifted down through the floorboards, discussing their next target, a wealthy widow in Tucson whose property adjoined several profitable mining claims. They planned to use the same combination of forged documents and strategic murder that had apparently served them well across multiple territories. Zeke carefully photographed several incriminating documents using an old camera he found among their equipment, then crept back to his shed to plan his escape. But as he opened the door, he found Isabella waiting for him in the darkness, a derringer pointed directly at his heart. "Did you really think we wouldn't notice your little investigation?" she asked softly, her Spanish accent more pronounced in the darkness. "We've been watching you since the day you accepted our offer. Every move, every curious glance, every moment of doubt, we've seen it all." "You're making a mistake," Zeke said, his hand moving slowly toward his concealed weapon. "Kill me, and you'll have the law asking questions you can't answer. I'm a known resident of this area. People will notice if I disappear." Isabella laughed, a sound like silver bells in a graveyard. "Oh, but you're not going to disappear. You're going to confess to a string of robberies and murders across 3 territories, overcome with guilt and remorse. Such a tragic story, a failed prospector driven to crime by desperation and failure. The sheriff will find your written confession along with evidence of your crimes, hidden right here on your own property." The shed door opened wider, revealing Vivian and Charlotte standing behind Isabella with grim satisfaction on their elegant features. In Charlotte's hands was a rope, and Vivian carried a forged confession that would paint Zeke as the mastermind behind their criminal enterprise. "The beauty of our operation," Vivian explained with professional pride, "is that we always have a scapegoat ready when it's time to move on to new territory. You're the 3rd property owner who's served this purpose, and I doubt you'll be the last. Men like you are so conveniently expendable." But Zeke had survived 27 years on the frontier by expecting trouble and preparing for it. As Isabella's attention focused on her partners, he lunged forward, knocking the derringer from her hand as he dove through the shed's back window. The sound of splintering wood and angry shouts filled the desert air as he rolled to his feet and sprinted toward the rocky outcropping where he had hidden his horse 3 days earlier. Gunshots cracked behind him like desert lightning as he vaulted into the saddle and spurred his horse toward Devil's Ridge. The photographs and documents he had stolen were tucked safely in his saddlebags, evidence enough to expose their operation to any honest lawman he could find. Behind him, he could hear the women organizing a pursuit, their refined facades finally dropping to reveal the ruthless criminals beneath. The chase lasted until dawn, winding through treacherous mountain passes and across sun-baked valleys where a single misstep could mean death. Zeke's intimate knowledge of the territory gave him advantages his pursuers couldn't match, but their superior numbers and resources made the outcome far from certain. As the sun crested the eastern peaks, Zeke spotted the dust cloud of approaching riders, but these weren't more of the women's associates. Marshal James Fletcher and a federal posse had been tracking the criminal organization across multiple territories, following a trail of forged documents and mysterious deaths that had finally led them to Arizona. The confrontation at Devil's Ridge lasted less than 10 minutes. Faced with federal marshals armed with arrest warrants and concrete evidence of their crimes, the three elegant ladies finally met opponents they couldn't manipulate or eliminate. Vivian Ashworth, Charlotte Pemberton, and Isabella Ramirez were revealed to be aliases for some of the most wanted criminals in the American West, responsible for dozens of deaths and hundreds of thousands of dollars in theft across 7 territories. The forged deed to Zeke's property was just one small piece in an elaborate criminal empire that had operated successfully for over 5 years, using charm, sophistication, and ruthless violence to prey upon isolated settlers and corrupt officials throughout the frontier. 6 months later, as Zeke sat on the front porch of his reclaimed cabin, watching another spectacular Arizona sunset, he reflected on how close he had come to becoming just another victim of their elaborate scheme. The 3 women were awaiting trial in Yuma Territorial Prison, their days of elegant criminality finally at an end. The frontier had taught him many lessons over the years, but perhaps the most important was that danger could wear any face and speak with any voice. Sometimes the most beautiful roses concealed the sharpest thorns, and sometimes the greatest threats came disguised as refined ladies seeking nothing more than frontier adventure. The desert wind whispered through the sage as Zeke Morrison finally found the peace that had eluded him for so long, master once again of his own small corner of the untamed West.